morning, DJ.
Morning. How are you guys?
Yeah, how are
Not
you?
too bad.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We're letting people start joining now, and we're gonna wait for Brandon from IDOE to join before we get started. We're gonna give people about 3 minutes past 10 to allow them to join before we get started.
Thank you everyone for joining the IDOE Bondry webinar. Real quickly before we begin, I just wanted to address, I know we've had some questions rolling about ESSER. I've been told that Cole Dietrich, who is the Director of Title Grants and Support, will field all questions. He is not on the webinar, unfortunately, but I will put his email address into the chat for all specific questions.
All right, thank you, Brandon. So today's session will be recorded, so any questions you may have will also be recorded. The format is a panel format. We have 3 speakers today. Heather Willey from Barnes & Thornburg, BJ Lippert from Donovan CPAs, and Nicole Serrano from Moody's Investment Services. We will be allowing them 20 minutes to speak. You may ask questions via the chat. We ask you not to interrupt the speakers while they're presenting and ask the questions via chat. There will be a short Q&A shortly thereafter where you will be able to unmute yourself and have a short discussion regarding the topics that were presented. But are there any questions before we get started from anyone? All right, well, I'd like to present our first speaker, which will be Heather Willey. If you go with me, I'm trying to pull up Heather's bio. So Heather's a very accomplished partner for Barnes & Thornburg, so I'm just going to do a quick, short introduction here, where Heather co-chairs the firm's charter school and charter innovation group. She advises education reform, including innovation network agreements with public school districts, charter school application development, and for-profit application assistance, the development of governing documents and bylaws, and implementation of and accountability to charter school authorizers. Heather has been intimately involved with the charter school and school reform movement since the inception of the laws in Indiana in 2001. So Heather is probably one of the biggest advocates in Indiana and is responsible for a lot of the things we get to enjoy today for charter schools. But I really can't do her justice and allow her to say a few words about herself before she gets her started. And Heather, I think you can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Oscar. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see all of you. I see several familiar names, Eddie and Paul, Bill, and others who I've worked with over the years. So it's great to reconnect with you this morning. I wish I could see your faces for real, but at least I get to see your pictures. So that's good. I'm going to share my screen just to talk a little bit this morning about what's been going on at the state legislature. It was a very busy session and one that doesn't seem to end. So I wanted to share a little bit about what's been happening. Before we get started, I wanted to give kind of an overview of the legislative leadership. So in the state legislature, we have 2 Republican supermajorities. In the House of Representatives, Speaker Todd Huston leads the House Republicans, and they now have 71 members after this last election cycle. The Democrats are led by House Minority Leader Phil Giaquina from Fort Wayne, and he leads 29 Democrats in the House for a total of 100 members of the House of Representatives. In the Senate, we're led by Senator Rod Bray, who serves 39 Republicans. So again, picking up some additional seats. And then a new leader and Senate Minority Leader Greg Taylor from Indianapolis. He serves as the leader of the 11 Democrats in the Senate Democratic Caucus. I also wanted to share we had a number of new and returning legislators who joined us this last legislative session. This has been a trend where we've seen a significant number of new members coming into the legislature every 2 years. A lot of that institutional knowledge of people serving 20, 30 plus years has kind of gone out the door as people have retired. And so you see a lot of new members who, you know, if you're in the charter school space or you're working in one of these districts, I really encourage you to reach out to these new members, ask them to come into your school, share a little bit about what you're doing. Many of them do not come with the background to some of the longer term issues we've had, and that can be both a positive and a negative. A good opportunity for us to be able to, move forward and share our story. At the same time, we need to make sure they understand some of the historical inequities for charter schools around things like funding and other programs. I will note as well, you'll see in District 78, a brand new member, Representative Tim O'Brien from the Evansville area. He replaced Representative Holly Sullivan, who was appointed towards the end of session as the new Indiana Secretary of State. So really came in with just a couple weeks left in the legislative session, which I'm sure was a very interesting time to serve. The budget session was this year. We were in a long session. We started back in November for Organization Day. That's when the legislature comes in, organizes themselves, swears in new members. And typically we would go through April 29th, which is the statutory date for sine die, which stands for the end. So the last day of session. This year, they changed the statutory date largely due to a couple key reasons. And so they ended on April 22nd, and the last day to adjourn sine die has now been changed just for 2021 to November 15th. Just earlier this week, yesterday, they were back in session. They came back in for Legislative Council, which is where they meet with all of the leaders to discuss some of the business of the legislature, including the summer interim committees. And then they also came back into session yesterday in the House and the Senate to override the governor's veto of Senate Bill 5, which is a bill related to restricting the governor's powers and the local officials' powers related to COVID and the pandemic. In the session, there's really two constitutional requirements for a long session. One is to pass the biennial budget, and the second is for redistricting, which is completed once in a decade, where they come in and they redraw all of Indiana's congressional and state legislative district maps. And that's really been slowed down. Typically, that would be a process completed before April 29th. However, due to COVID and the federal shutdown that occurred at the beginning of 2020, that data and that information from the US Federal Census Bureau is delayed. And so they're expected to come back sometime in the October timeframe when Indiana receives that information to be able to finalize those maps. The other thing that they really left the session open to, in addition to the redistricting, one is they wanted to have the opportunity to override any of the governor's vetoes and do it in a more timely way, specifically Senate Bill 5, which they did yesterday. And two is the legislature wants to appropriate any of the monies coming in from the federal government related to COVID-19. They, in the budget process, appropriated the monies that was available from the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. And they want to continue to do that. So they're leaving the session open to ensure that they have that voice in the process on a go forward basis. You may have also seen a bill earlier in the session that the governor vetoed and was overridden by the legislature regarding this appropriation process. That particular piece of legislation has now resulted in litigation with the governor suing the legislature over the overreach in his estimation of the legislative power. So that will continue to play out over the next several weeks. In the session, they passed House Enrolled Act 1372. I referenced this earlier. It was a piece of legislation to actually extend the sine die date, as well as the requirements for when bills have to be presented to the governor and signed only for the 2021 session. So putting some additional kind of oversight and guardrails on the governor's signature authority. Probably the most important thing, as I mentioned earlier, is passing the state biennial budget. they appropriated significant money from the federal program that was just passed in the American Rescue Plan Act. And there was $1.9 billion in new money appropriated for K-12 education. So a huge and significant influx of additional dollars into the K-12 budget. The State Budget Committee really started out back in the fall very concerned about the revenue coming in. For many, many weeks, schools, and I know many of you come down to the legislature during that process, we're told no, there won't be any new money. We're worried about the budget. We're worried about the state's revenues. The April forecast came back very strong and projected to increase revenues of more than 4% in each of the next 2 years. So that led to a new $37.4 billion proposal for the next biennium. This will give you a little bit of sense of how the budget is spent. And I'm going to go into some of the education items in more detail. But what you can see is that more than 50% of Indiana's state budget is spent on K-12 education. The next most significant line item in the budget is Medicaid, followed by higher education, and then everything else that falls in the more general fund obligations are a much smaller piece of that pie. Student funding, a very good year for K-12 education in terms of student funding. State's tuition support will grow by 4.6% in fiscal year 2022 and by 4.3% in additional funding in fiscal year 2023. So big growth in state tuition support. They increased the complexity amount for students with complex backgrounds by $100 million and increased most special ed grants by 5% in fiscal year 2022 and 10% in fiscal year 2023. English language learning was increased by $5 million or 18%. And I think for all of us here on the phone, a very significant increase in terms of the Charter and Innovation Network grants. Those were, as you may recall, per student money that sort of was an offset to the fact that charter schools do not receive facility dollars funded by state and local taxes. So currently, this per student amount is $750 per student. That was increased to $1,000 in year one of the budget and $1,250 in year two. So really nice increases with respect to the Charter and Innovation Network grants. Few bills I wanted to highlight just so that you can make sure that you're working with your legal counsel to ensure you have the right policies, working with your fiscal officers to make sure you're reviewing important information. One of them was House Enrolled Act 1040. It deals with sudden cardiac arrest of students. So if you're running a student athletic program, it could be band, it could be cheerleading, it could be football, basketball, any of those activities, soccer, where students might have a heightened, experience of, cardiac arrest when they're, active in activities. It does change the system by which you have to notify parents of any kind of symptom that is experienced by the student during that athletic activity. It's important to have a policy in place. So I encourage you to make sure you're reviewing this legislation in detail, that you are putting in place a policy and a set of procedures for any of your students participating in such activities. You have additional requirements in this bill to talk with parents, to notify and get their permission, as well as who can actually clear a student for return to play. So encourage you to take a close look at this and make sure that your policies and procedures are in place and compliant with this new legislation. 1384, this is a bill that's been discussed for a number of years regarding civics education. The language will go into effect on July 2nd, 2022, as it requires the Department of Education to set up new standards for civics education course. Following the department, each school corporation and charter school are required to ensure that a student complete at least one semester of civics education in grades 6, 7, and 8. And it does give some lag time in terms of implementation for planning purposes and for scheduling, pushing back that effective date to the 2023-2024 school year. So lots of time here to begin to plan and think about the increased requirements for civics education. 1514 is a very comprehensive bill. I think some of the key things that I want to note there is it creates a dashboard for parents to find the best schools for their students. It maintains Indiana's A through F student classification for schools, but it does delay for an additional year the results of iLearn counting towards any sort of score or grade for the school. It will implement iLearn on a go forward basis, and it also requires that the Department of Education prepare a report on learning loss and provides very specific metrics for learning loss activities that need to be studied by the Department of Education. And that report is due to the governor, to the superintendent of public instruction, and to a number of different entities, including the legislature, by December 1st of this year. It also repeals the consequences for failing charter schools and rests that activity with the authorizer to hold those schools accountable for results. So very comprehensive piece of legislation, a number of different things to review as you go forward. Education matters. I will, sort of breeze through this. Does provide some notice to schools about how information can be maintained on the department's website. Provides that charter schools may give preference to children who attend another charter school that's closed because of an action by the State Board of Education, and includes a number of other authorizer requirements. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Teacher training, I'm not going to read this just in the interest of time, but wanted to include some information on this particular legislation for your review. And I'll ensure Oscar can, distribute the slides, following this presentation. School buildings, this is one I think charter schools are very excited about. It increases the enforcement of Indiana's unused building law. It runs it through the Indiana Attorney General and gives more teeth in the oversight of how this law is working and the accountability for public school corporations to ensure that those vacant or unused buildings are put on the unused building list for charter schools. There's a charter school study that was included in SEA 413. It creates a 15-member panel to really look at charter school funding and charter school equity and submit their results by November 1st of 2022. This is one we'll all want to keep a close eye on, as it's really looking at the funding gap between charters and traditional public schools. And I encourage you all to make sure you have a mechanism for weighing in. I know that's something the Indiana Charter School Network will be doing as well, but really encourage you to keep a close eye on the activities of this particular committee. Various education matters, there's a number of different things included. You'll see one thing is that you must adopt and implement an internet use policy. Again, this is something I encourage you to reach out to legal counsel about. Make sure you have a policy in place that meets the requirements of this particular new law that is taking effect on July the 1st. ESSER 3, I know that Brandon mentioned this, and I did want to just include a link. Cole Dietrich has been very helpful along with his colleagues as they work through a number of issues about what uses you can use the ESSER $3 for. They've got a running FAQ that they're updating on a regular basis, and they're also communicating regularly with the U.S. Department of Education to be able to glean the intent of this law. And so if you go into the hyperlink there, you'll be able to see that FAQ. And again, it's being updated regularly. If you do submit a question to Cole or to one of your grant specialists at the department, they will ensure it gets answered, and then they will publish that so that others can glean the answer as well. So you'll see those applications are opening up on May 14th. Got a very tight window to turn them around, and we'll have, a good amount of time to make sure that the funding is spent, but a lot of new money coming into the state for education through the ESSER III funding. I wanted to share just in the back here, there's a new legislator appendix. Again, I encourage you to take a look at these new members, get to know them, invite them out to your schools, and make sure they understand, the value and importance of charter schools. So with that, Oscar, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I'll stick around in case there's any questions at a later time.
Okay, I'll open it up for anybody that is on the line to ask Heather any questions at this point. Feel free to unmute and ask away. I'll give you 1 minute. All right, well, I took quite a bit of notes. I will keep my eye out on 413 and specific to the...
Sorry, Oscar, this is Henry Fernandez. I have a question. I know you said 1 minute, but only 10 seconds went by before.
I meant 1 minute for you guys to go ahead and ask questions.
All right, thanks. A question about the complexity index. Clearly, $100 million were added to the total budget, but not that much per student. Is that correct? Is it only $100 per student?
Yes, that's correct. So they're really, I think with the complexity index, this is something that we need. We need to continue to advocate with legislators about the importance of the complexity index. I think it's been over the last several years, we've seen this trend as, traditional urban schools funding has gone down and declined as they've tried to increase, the funding amounts for tuition support in the suburban and rural, districts. And in doing that, I think, Henry, you probably, depending on where you set, we do see more complex students traditionally in our urban settings. And so the complexity index always provided, significant increased dollars for those urban schools serving those students. And I think as they've attempted to equalize funding to suburban and rural schools, you've seen a natural decline, in the amount of money going to the complexity index. So yes, you're right. While we have 100 million, when you think about spreading it across 294, public school districts, charter schools, and others, that are eligible to receive it, it's not a significant amount per student.
One quick follow-up question: is the English language learner funding included in the complexity index, or is that a separate amount?
It's not. It's pulled out separately. So they did a $5 million increase, which is an 18% increase to the line item in the Indiana state budget for ELL. And that's pretty significant in terms, it's still, again, $5 million spread across, our multiple, number of schools. It's still not a huge amount of money, but it is really one of the, first times we've seen such a significant increase in that line item in the budget for a number of years.
All right, thank you. And I will say that's not sufficient. There are 77 school districts in the state that have at least 10% Latino enrollment, and 4 of them are Latino majority. So I think that even that $5 million is going to be spread out very thinly. All right, Thank you very much, Heather.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we know too, we've got school districts, Fort Wayne, for example, serving large Burmese populations, where they're serving, 20, 30 plus languages, in any single school. So yeah, it's a difficult task for sure, but at least some additional money in the budget.
All right, thank you, Henry. Anybody else? All right, Heather, thank you so much. Again, this is being recorded, and we'll try to make it available to the authorizers. Hopefully they can distribute it to you guys to share with your peers. Well, next on will be BJ. Let me pull up your bio, BJ. again, you guys are way too accomplished. So I will pick something to talk about here, BJ, that hopefully doesn't offend you. All right. So BJ is a Bulldog alumnus. He received his master's in professional accountancy and bachelor's of science in accounting from Butler University, 2015. BJ joined the Donovan team, where he leads the firm's assurance services group and is a member of the leadership team. He is responsible for audits, reviews, compilations, and consulting with clients in all industries. Now, this may not be on BJ's bio, but I consider him an expert on all things charter schools. I think that Donovan has a significant market share of charter schools. And oftentimes, whenever I have any accounting questions regarding charter schools, BJ's probably the person I call more often than not, just because of their expertise. So, a wealth of knowledge when it comes to accounting and FASB changes that come through and affect the schools. But I'll turn it over to BJ. You should be able to have control to share your presentation. Again, I ask everybody to ask your questions on the chat, and then we'll have an open discussion after his presentation. Take it away, BJ.
Can everybody hear me okay? Quick thumbs up, awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction. You're too kind. We do try to be a resource when tricky accounting questions come up, and they do come up quite often. So I appreciate that we can be there and offer that service for you. It's great to see so many familiar faces here. I do believe our firm serves quite a few of the people represented here in the schools that they represent. So great to see everybody here. For those of you who haven't worked with me, I'm BJ Lippert with Donovan CPAs. I'm a partner. I do work in a number of industries, but I keep myself busiest in the fall working on the audits of charter schools. So we serve around 30 or so, and that number grows every year. So it's what we do. There are a lot of unique kind of intricate accounting matters that come up specific to charter schools. And a big part of the value I think we bring is helping schools navigate the specific accounting matters related to their industry. So I'm going to share my screen here. I can figure this out. So when I will say this just as a qualifier, when Oscar invited me to present today and I agreed, I thought, May 11th, that's great. Tax season will be 3 weeks past. By this point, I should have had a couple of weeks of vacation under me. I'll be good and refreshed and ready to go. Well, I'm sure most of you know tax season got extended and we're now 6 days away from it. So if I'm a bit frazzled or this information is repetitive or whatever, give me a little bit of grace. So what we're going to talk about today is the importance of accurate financial reporting. My sincere hope is that virtually everything in this presentation is a refresher course for people sitting through this call. There's nothing in here that's rocket science. I promise I'm not going to talk about any new accounting standards or anything coming out. Oftentimes what we encounter when we go to conduct an audit is, there are a handful of schools that take the audits really seriously and see the value in it and appreciate the services that we do. But there's an equally large population of schools that view the audit and their financial reporting as just a box to check. Get in, do the audit, get out of my way so I can do more important things. My goal and my hope today is to kind of help you understand what the audit process is, why we do it, who reviews the results, and identify some pitfalls that could potentially happen if the audit isn't taken seriously, financial reporting isn't a priority for the school and its leadership. Again, my sincere hope is that this is just kind of a refresher course for everybody, but we'll talk through the material, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to handle those at the end. So let's see. That's me. That's my contact information, quick bio. I think Oscar covered most of that in his introduction. Donovan, again, we do specialize in the audits of charter schools. We try to advise as much as possible any clients, any schools that have started to pick a CPA firm, whether it's us or another of the handful of firms that do this in the state. Pick a firm that has experience specific to charter schools. There's so many pitfalls. There are so many relationships to manage. There are so many ways that things could go wrong. It really does help to have a CPA firm that has experience doing these specific kinds of audits. Again, doesn't have to be us. Of course, we'd love to work with anybody who has that need, but really you want that level of expertise behind you in the conduct of your audit. So why are we here today? We're going to talk about the importance of accurate financial reporting, broken into three main categories: the basics of annual financial reporting, what could go wrong, and then what could you do to ensure you have accurate financial reporting. As far as the basics go, who requires an audit? I'm sure most of you are aware it's required for all charter schools. It's required by state law. It's administered and overseen by the Indiana State Board of Accounts and your school's authorizers. So if you look to the root cause of why is an audit required, why do I have to do this? It's state law, and it is used by multiple parties annually to assess your financial results. Bear in mind, the audit results are public record, so you can do a quick search on the State Board of Accounts website to find any charter school and their financial results, both the audited financial statements and the audit of the internal controls for those schools are available to anybody who's interested and wants to use them. So you can see the users there: State Board of Accounts, Department of Education, your school's authorizer. But it goes beyond that. So lenders, we're going to talk to, we have a representative from Moody's here today who does a lot of work utilizing the results of what we present. She'll talk to you about how she uses these financial results, I'm sure. So obviously parents and communities also care about the financial results of their school. Anyone who wants to know, is this school going to be around for a while, might take that extra step and look at the financial results and say, how's the school doing? Another user of the financial statements you want to absolutely keep in mind is the media. So good, bad, or indifferent, the results that are presented in your audited financial statements are public record, and they are available to the media, and they can spin those positively or negatively or accurately, you know, whatever they want to do with that. That information is out there. Different users have different motivations for reviewing your results. No surprise there. So the basics: what is an audit? It's a multi-part approach that we take, kind of three prongs broken into these three categories. The first that every charter school has to go through annually is an audit under generally accepted accounting principles. So there's a set of accounting standards that every single charter school in the state of Indiana has to apply. Same standards that are applicable to any other charter school or any other, any other nonprofit organization that reports under generally accepted accounting principles. It's a uniform set of accounting standards that we apply to make sure that there's comparability and reliability in those numbers. The second part that every charter school has to go through is an audit of compliance with the State Board of Accounts Internal Control Manual. And there'll be a link for that a little bit later in my presentation, but there's a pretty thick 45 or so page document with internal controls that every charter school is expected to comply with. There's some wiggle room within there, but most of the internal controls you're required to comply with are mandated by the state, and we are required as auditors to audit in accordance with that manual as well. So those controls are expected to be there. The third prong of your audit, which may or may not apply, and actually we're starting to see more and more schools get kicked into this threshold. If you have expenditures of federal grants in excess of $750,000 annually, measured over your fiscal year, it triggers the need for what's called a single audit under the uniform guidance. So what a single audit is we examine your federal grants. We identify the major grant or grants based on a number of things such as size of the grant, dollars spent, any that are specifically identified and required to be tested under the federal program. And we subject that specific grant to a more stringent audit than we do for just the generally accepted accounting principles audit. So we look at similar kind of things. Was the money spent properly? Was it spent in accordance with the grant? Do you have a system of internal controls? Is your reporting proper, et cetera, et cetera? but it's kind of a version 2.0. It's a more stringent audit that gets kind of tagged on top of the generally accepted accounting principles audit. That's the basics of it. I think I just walked through essentially what this is. The GAAP audit, you can look at this, review that slide. Again, none of this should be a surprise to anybody on this call. If you reviewed your financial statements before, you've seen all this information. State Board of Accounts internal control audit. Again, there's the link for it right there. All the information is available on the SBOA's website. And then the third thing is the uniform guidance audit. Again, I kind of went over that at a high level. I don't want to bore anybody on this phone call, but again, if you're reviewing this webinar through the recorded version, you can pause and look at that, and feel free to reach out to me with any specific questions related to those things. When are audits required? You can see in that first bullet pointed area, the first audit for your school is required in the year after your first year of operations. So if you open this fall, 2021, your fiscal year ends in June of 2022, your first audit will occur for the year ended June 30th, 2022, and the audit itself will happen in the fall of 22 with an expected due date, a wrap-up date of December 31st annually. You see that those due dates can be extended on that third bullet point, but only for justifiable cause. We have had several of those situations recently. Obviously, the pandemic hit threw everyone in a tailspin. You have so many things coming at you and other priorities to address. The State Board of Accounts and a lot of the authorizers offered some grace and extended a lot of those due dates for the audits. So just bear that in mind, that the goal is always to get it done no later than December 31st. But if there is some sort of justifiable cause for a need for an extension, we can advocate on your behalf, get an extension. It's a pretty informal process, but we do have to be proactive about requesting those things. Audit scheduling is flexible. Again, usually happens between August 1st and the end of the year. Fieldwork can take, depending upon the size and complexity of your school, anywhere from a few days to a week plus. That's going to vary a little bit by auditor, but for us, it's rare that a school, the actual fieldwork component of the audit that we do is more than a week. It could take a month or two to do some of the wrap-up processes and gather additional information and requests, but the fieldwork component should just be a week or so if you work with Donovan. So here's kind of the whole point of what I wanted to bring up today is what could go wrong. So again, my whole goal today is to get you to understand and appreciate the value of accurate financial reporting. So what could go wrong if that isn't a priority and you're not focused on accurate financial reporting? Here's just a few things that I came up with as I was brainstorming and preparing for this meeting. So inaccurate financial reporting is likely to lead to any number of these things here. So undiagnosed, undetected weaknesses in internal control. Again, that's a big part of what we do with that State Board of Accounts compliance manual, is making sure that the set of internal controls is standard across all charter schools and there are no deviations in your process. You're welcome to have more stringent internal controls, but you can't go below a certain threshold on those controls. Disparate system of internal controls among various charter schools. Again, we want consistency so people know that they can look at results from different schools and they're comparative. Without accurate financial reporting, that third bullet point, it could lead to inconsistency in accounting treatment of similar accounting transactions. We want to make sure that charter schools A, B, C, D, all the way through Z are all recording the similar type of transactions in the same way. If one school accounts for a lease as an operating lease, another one accounts for it as a capital lease, but in essence, they're exact same thing, all of a sudden your financial statements aren't comparable. You can't make good financial decisions based off of them. So we want to make sure that we've got consistent accounting treatment across the population of charter schools. This is a big one here, that fourth bullet point, incorrect going concern conclusions. So for those of you not in the accounting world, going concern is actually, it's a good thing. If your entity is a going concern, your school is a going concern, it means that there's every likelihood and every expectation that your school will continue for at least 12 months from the date of our audit report. So if we issue our audit report December 31st, 2021, and we identify that you are a going concern, everything's going well, we expect that you'll still be in operation December 31st, 2022. If you have inaccurate financial reporting, again, there could be all sorts of risks out there, financial risks, off-balance sheet risks, that could lead you to the conclusion, oh yes, we're fine, we have no financial matters to be concerned about here, when in all actuality, you might be, just one small financial disaster away from failure. So we want to have accurate financial results. So if there is something, a going concern issue, that we can identify that as early as possible and identify steps to correct that and get you on the right path. The next bullet point down, without accurate financial reporting, you could make strategic decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate financial data. So again, you might think things are going really well, when in all actuality, you haven't accounted for things properly. You don't have the full picture of what's really going on at your school. You might make some pretty bad strategic decisions. You might take out a loan that you really can't repay. You might sign an agreement to build a building that you're really not ready to build. Again, it all starts with good financial reporting. Going a little bit further down the list, there could be a lack of access to lending. If a lot of lenders, the first thing they're going to do is ask for your audited financial statements. If you can't provide them with a set of audited financial statements with an unqualified opinion on them, there's a very good chance you're going to have a difficult time getting access to capital, getting access to lending. So again, it all comes back to the numbers. There could be unidentified cost savings or grant opportunities that should be self-explanatory. The presumption of financial health, while there are risks present, if you're not accounting for things properly, there could be risks out there that you haven't even identified. And then I think far too often we ignore that last bullet point. I said lack of transparency to the public, leading to a lack of public trust. So what you want to do, I think a big part of your role as leaders of charter schools is to ensure that you are as open of a book as you can possibly be with the public. Because in the absence of reliable information that you proactively give to the public, more often than not, we seem to see that the public is going to assume the worst. And if you're not giving them information proactively, that you're hiding something. So what we want to do is have accurate, timely, publicly available information that says, hey, we're an open book, there's nothing we're hiding here. So what can you do? Okay, if we want to avoid all those things, we want to make sure that we're on the accurate financial reporting train. What are the things that we could do? Again, nothing's rocket science here, but these are all areas where we've seen schools we work with in the past fall short, not make priorities. So I bring them to your attention today in hopes that you're not one of these schools, but if you are, let's have a conversation and get on the right path. So what are the things you can do to ensure accurate financial reporting? Setting your school up for success. The first thing you can do if your school is not yet open, a lot of authorizers will actually require what's called a pre-opening internal control assessment. So it's just what it sounds like. We come in and do kind of an early audit of internal controls. We look at the State Board of Accounts manual. We look at the system of internal controls that you have in place. We'll read through your accounting procedures manual, and we try to identify gaps before the audit actually occurs. What you don't want to do is go through a full year of operations of your school and then find out after you've been doing things for 12 months that the way you've been doing it is wrong. Now all of a sudden you've got findings. Now all of a sudden you have to unwind those transactions. So what we want to do is get it right up front. The second thing is to hire an experienced employee or bookkeeper trained in the intricacies of charter school record keeping. I kind of gave that introduction when it comes to your auditors as well. You want to make sure you've got an auditor who really knows the ins and outs of charter schools. It absolutely is the exact same scenario on your bookkeeper side. So whether you hire somebody internally or you outsource that to a bookkeeping firm, make sure that they know how to do bookkeeping, record keeping specifically for charter schools, that they have a great working knowledge of grant management, grant applications, that sort of thing. Third thing down on that list, review your financial results regularly, looking for anomalies and trends. Don't just assume because you get an audit every year that everything's fine. You need to look at your financial results monthly, if not monthly, at least quarterly. Look for changes. Look for things that went up or down significantly. Look for, again, trends. If your costs are going up, let's ask questions. Does that make sense? Are there cost saving opportunities we can find? If your revenues are going down, why are revenues going down? Are we not applying for reimbursement on our grants timely, et cetera? So make sure that you make that a priority in your board meetings or your finance committee meetings as you conduct those. The fourth one, this is a personal mission of mine that I'm really trying to get all of my clients to take to heart. Discuss complex, non-recurring accounting transactions with your school's auditors mid-year rather than during the audit. Nobody likes surprises. That includes your auditors. A perfect audit for me is one where we come in and have to make 0 adjustments and 0 internal control recommendations, and we get to give you a clean bill of health and say everything looks great. A big part of that is getting things correct up front, recording complex transactions correctly the first time around. If you are considering that, if you're leasing something big, if you're buying a new building, if you're selling equipment, if you're doing anything outside of the ordinary course of business, reach out to your CPAs and say, hey, I'm about to engage in this specific transaction. Can we have a discussion to make sure I get this right on the front end? Second to last bullet point there, don't view the audit as a check the box compliance only task. Lean on your auditors, lean on your CPAs. That's, oftentimes there's only a couple of times a year that we actually engage with these schools. Again, they've got so much to do on their plates. What we want to do is start to work toward a working relationship with our schools where we have open discussions with them. We help them do that trending, that benchmarking, identifying those complex transactions. If you just view the audit as a get in, check the box, get out of the way, you'll never have an opportunity to tap in that resource, which is the CPA firm that's conducting your audit. We've got exposure to, again, a number of your competitors, a number of your peers. We see things that they're doing well, not doing well, and we love having those discussions. During the audit, it's a great time to lean on your CPAs. And the last bullet point, and I'll close on this, is to ensure that your board of directors is actively engaged. You can see this is among the single most important success factors in charter schools that thrive versus those that struggle and ultimately fail. It's like night and day when we engage with certain boards of directors. There are some that are wildly engaged and they care about every detail and they care about every audit adjustment, and they're comparing their prior year audit results with their current year audit results to make sure that they're progressing and improving and headed in the right direction. And then on the other hand, there are boards of directors that, for the life of us, we can't even get in touch with them. Can't get contact information with them. We go to review the board minutes and we see that they haven't met for the past 3 months. There's a strong correlation between the strength and the engagement, institutional knowledge that comes with the board of directors and the success of the schools that they serve. So if you're early stages in a school, if you're in the first few years of your operations, do an assessment. Make sure that you've got the right people in place to lead that school. You want people like Heather who have a working, deep knowledge of charter school laws in the state. They understand the trends. They understand what just happened in the General Assembly and what sort of changes are coming your way. For independence reasons, I can't sit on the boards for the schools that I serve, but I have been on finance committees for other charter schools and lended my expertise in that regard. So I can help them, think through the financial matters and things that impact them. So, and it's not just that. It could be former educators. It could be, really engaged parents of students that attend your school. Just think through, what does the perfect board of directors look like, and how do I get those people engaged and participating in what I do? And again, that's my hope in a perfect world, is that nobody learned a single thing from my presentation, because you already know all this information and it's second hat. For those of you who feel like this is new information, or you heard something that I said and said, uh-oh, we're not on the right path in that regard, my contact information is right there. Email is probably the best because you just kind of never know with my schedule, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I don't nickel and dime for phone calls and emails. Even if you're not a client of ours, I'm here to help. So with that, I'll turn it back to Oscar, and I appreciate everybody's attention. I know accounting can be a dry material sometimes, so I appreciate everybody at least pretending to pay attention.
Yeah, thank you, BJ. I'll open it up to anybody on the call for questions. I do have one, but before I ask it, I'd like to open it up to anybody on the call.
Oscar, am I still sharing my screen?
You are.
All right, I'm trying to figure out how to, oh, there we go.
Hey, BJ. This is Lonnie from Pilot Ed. How are
Hi,
you?
Lonnie.
Thank
I'm
you
well.
for
How are
getting
you?
on this call. I'm good. I feel like you were talking about us when you talked about the operating lease versus the capital expense lease, because that is what we're dealing with right now. We're part of the CSDC group, I guess, and we have a lease that is currently being recognized as a capital expense instead of an operation one, which is making our debt to asset ratio look horrible. So I was just wondering, what are some of the next steps for Donovan in terms of supporting the state and the charter schools in the state with a more, I guess, unilateral way of looking at these leases, because we do feel like we're kind of getting the shorter end of the stick.
Yeah, and I do know we owe you a conversation to discuss that, make sure that we got the accounting treatment for it correctly. Quite honestly, Lonnie, this issue is going to be a non-issue in a couple of years when the new lease standard takes place.
133 audits since January. 150 waiting to be sent out between us, food, and special ed.
Sorry.
I literally don't know. I just emailed.
Sorry, I got a
That
little
sounds like
distracted.
Beatrice.
Yeah, I'll talk over it. It's all good. So when the new lease accounting standard takes effect, it will actually require balance sheet presentation for all leases, including those that are deemed to be operating. So this is going to impact a lot of schools. Anyone that has any sort of significant lease transactions. You are correct that it does. It impacts your financial ratios, but we'll have to look through that and make sure that we got the accounting treatment correct under US GAAP as it's currently presented.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll make a note to myself to reach out to you.
All right. Thanks, BJ.
BJ, I have a couple of questions for you, but actually, let me pause there and allow anybody else that has a question before I dive in. Okay, the first question I have for you is around, through the pandemic, schools saw an influx of federal funds via PPP, CARES Act distribution, and now we're starting to see ESSER come through for schools. For those schools that have not gone through a single audit, could you just talk through what they should expect or what they could be doing to ensure that that process is streamlined for them, as it is a little bit different than what they may be used to on a non-federal portion of the audit?
Sure, and I'm happy to speak to that. To address the first part of your question, for those of you who did receive Paycheck Protection Program loans, whether or not they've been forgiven, I am happy to report that those are not subject to single audit. So they are federal funds, but we won't include those in the calculation of how many federal dollars were spent during your fiscal year. Any other CARES Act funds, including ESSER funds, will need to be included in that. So it's a double-edged sword. You got some additional funding, which is great, but we do expect, and we're in the planning phase of our 2021 audits right now. We do expect that a significant number of schools that haven't been subject to single audit in years past will be subject to single audit this year. As I mentioned in my presentation, it's an add-on kind of audit to what we already do. So we're going to come in and do the same things that we've done in years past, your gap audit, your internal control assessment. And then on top of that, we're going to identify your major federal program. And then we're going to do a deep dive on that program itself. So there are certain things, and any of you who have applied for these grants or requested reimbursement under them, it's going to be information you have already prepared and already have available, but we're going to look at the claims that were submitted to make sure that they were in line with the grant. We're going to make sure that everything you submitted to the state is as accurate as can be. The level of materiality that we use on these, unfortunately, goes down versus the regular audit. So there's a little bit less that we have in leeway to use our auditor's judgment in reporting things. We make sure that you've done the necessary compliance related things in accordance with the grants. Really, those things vary kind of wildly based on which grant gets tested. In years past, it's often been Title I, the Child Nutrition Program. The implementation grants often get selected, but I have a feeling that the ESSER money going forward, given the dollar amounts involved, are going to be the largest ones going forward. So varies by school, varies by grant, but we'll kind of walk you through that process. It's nothing to be scared of. It's just another step to complete in the audit journey.
And in regards to the PPP forgiveness, some audits were reflecting PPP as debt and maybe converting to a grant. Will that require a restatement, or how are you seeing those being handled?
No, this is, that's a great question. So this is what I would consider a gray area in generally accepted accounting principles. And at least the way our firm has approached it, after reading the standards and understanding the options that these charter schools and other nonprofits have, is you get to make the decision as a management team at the school of whether you deem it to be a liability or whether you deem it to be more essentially like a grant fund. So the most simple scenario is if you get a PPP loan and it gets forgiven in a current fiscal year, that's a pretty clear indicator that that was a grant that should be recorded as revenue to the school. The next most clear tier of these PPP loans is if you take out a loan, it's not forgiven during the fiscal year, but it's forgiven shortly after the fiscal year. I would say 9 times out of 10, what our clients decided to do in that situation was to record the revenue in the year in which the loan was received. They said, we already know it's forgiven. Why not just go ahead and record this in the year when we got it? We're going to match our expenses with our revenue, which makes a lot of sense. And then you get into a little bit murkier water when you've taken out a PPP loan, the fiscal year has ended, you're into your next fiscal year. You may have applied for forgiveness but not received it, or you may be anticipating applying for forgiveness, but again, have not received it. In those situations, management needs to make a judgment call and say, are we applying for 100% forgiveness of this loan? And do we anticipate actually receiving 100% forgiveness for that loan? If they can attest to that and they want to record it as grant revenue, we've signed off on that presentation. The more conservative approach, which some of our schools took as well, was to say, we're going to wait until this thing is actually forgiven before we record it as revenue. And again, the position we've taken on that has been, as long as they can justify the position they've taken and then they disclose it in the financial statements and the footnotes of the financial statements, either presentation is acceptable under generally accepted accounting principles. But you're right, there is a kind of a variance in the way those are treated. And a lot of it boils down to management's risk tolerance by school.
No, perfect. That makes complete sense. Anybody else on the call with any questions, follow-ups for BJ before moving on?
Thank you all. I appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you, BJ. All right, so our last presenter will be Nicole Serrano. So Nicole is a vice president, senior analyst with U.S. Public Finance, with the U.S. Public Finance Group at Moody's Investor Services. Nicole's vice president, senior analyst for the New York local government's rating team, covering credits primarily in the northeastern U.S. Nicole is the leader of the Charter School Ratings Task Force. Before joining the New York local government's rating team, Nicole was an analyst for the housing team. Prior to joining Moody's, Nicole worked with BNP, I'm saying this wrong, Paribas. Nicole holds an MPA from the New York University, Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service with concentration in finance and economics, and a BA from Pace University. But with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Hi, everybody. I feel like we've lost a couple of people. I've really enjoyed Heather and BJ's presentations because when we as Moody's evaluate the credit quality of a charter school, we're kind of taking a fully formed cake, right? And looking at that cake and making a judgment. But what goes into that cake is the work that you all do with your auditor, your understanding of the legal rules that govern charter schools in your state. And so much of what BJ and Heather already spoke about are things that we consider during the ratings process. It's just work that sort of happens with you behind the scenes, and then it's presented to us as sort of one cohesive picture. I know that we've been holding questions until the end. I don't mind if you guys have questions as we go through the slides. I do have slides to present, but if you have questions, I'm more than happy to make it, sort of interactive and answer questions as we go. If anyone is considering, accessing the capital markets and possibly coming to a rating agency in the near term, if you have specific questions, more than happy to address my comments to your specific questions and needs. With that being said, let me see if this share screen is going to work. I hope. Okay. So again, I do have a bunch of slides, but I feel like we've already gone an hour. So maybe I'll sort of run through these a little bit more briefly. Moody's job in the market, right, is to provide independent, reliable opinions. I work in US public finance. We cover a variety of issuer types, so cities, school districts, K-12 school districts, hospitals, housing authorities, and we also have a group that specifically looks at charter schools. Our charter school group spans the country. We have analysts in New York, Dallas, Chicago, and San Francisco, who are all now, of course, in their homes, in those in areas adjacent to those offices. But during normal times, we do have analysts across the country. And when we're able to site visit for charter schools specifically, we do like to come out for site visits for every new charter school that we evaluate. We publish our opinions in the form of ratings. I'm going to show you the rating scale in just a second. We also provide the market with written research. And our goal is to be as transparent as we possibly can be, both with the market, the people using our ratings, so investors, and also with you as issuers. We want to be as clear and transparent with you all as to what our process is and the different things that we look at when we evaluate charter school credit risk. This is our rating scale, just for those of you who aren't familiar. Most of our charter ratings sit right here in the BAA to BA range. BAA is the cutoff point for investment grade. So from a BAA 1, 2, and 3, BAA 3 is the last investment grade rating. And at BA, we're in a speculative grade. From BA and below is a speculative grade part of the ratings scale. I want to take you through our ratings process. I feel like people are typically interested in, what goes on behind the scenes for us. Like I said, if you have questions, please, please, please just interrupt me. I'm more than happy to talk as we go. But this is the basic process that we have. So you would be working with your financial advisor. Your financial advisor would reach out to me. We would have an analyst assigned, one of those analysts that works specifically on charter school credit in one of our offices around the country. The methodology, there is just one methodology for charter schools, so there's no identifying an appropriate methodology. We just have one for charters, and I'm going to show you some key components of that in a sec. Then we start information gathering and discussion. And this is sort of the most important part. So in terms of information gathering, what is the sort of the crux of the information that we're looking at? Your audit. So all of the things that BJ just spoke about and the importance of an audit, those things become very important when you're trying to access the capital markets. And our first sort of question is, well, can you send me 5 years of audited financial statements or 3 years of audited financial statements or however many years the school has been in existence? And we take those audits and we spread them so that we're consistent, apples to apples for charters across the country. And then this step 4, this discussion process. We also find, just to piggyback off of one of BJ's comments, we're having discussions with your financial leadership at the school. Oftentimes we'll also have a principal or a superintendent that wants to speak to the school's vision, right? We want to understand your mission, your reason for existence, what sets you apart from other schools, either your district schools or your other charter competitors. Here it also becomes real important for us to know that the board is engaged. And so when we're in this discussion process, having a board member on the call actually is quite important. And I would agree with what BJ said earlier. When we see a very engaged board, typically that's a sign of credit strength. There's something good going on there, right? We're seeing an engaged board. There's typically with an engaged board, nice financial controls coming through. The board is typically paying attention to variances in the budget to actuals, paying attention to the audit process. All of that is really important. And we get a sense of that even without visiting you in person due to COVID, even over a telephone call, that really does come through. And it is one of the things that we look at. And I'll take you through some more of the discussion points when we talk about the methodology in just a minute. The next step is we'll go through a committee process. Most people are curious about it, so I'll give you a little bit of insight as to how we make our secret sauce. All of our ratings are determined by committee. No one analyst has its own say in deciding a rating. Committees are decided by majority vote. So you will always have at least 3 people in a rating committee. For charter school rating committees, they're typically fairly large. And we invite experts from across different areas of public finance to participate in the charter committee. So we'll have your K-12 analyst who understands the school district in Indiana, in this case, that we're working in. Other charter analysts who work across the country and bring, just a big perspective or a broad perspective, to the discussion. Analysts that work in higher education and have an understanding of the competitive nature of charters, as well as, possibly just local government analysts working in the city or the county that we're in your state. So a variety of approaching the discussion from a variety of perspectives helps to create a very robust discussion. And that is, generally Moody's process is to have robust, lengthy discussions around ratings when we're in that rating committee process. We have one methodology for charters. I'm going to share with you the key components of that methodology in a sec. The methodology is boiled down to something called a scorecard. The purpose of a scorecard is to act as a starting point. It helps us to really focus all of the information that we get from you guys, all of the discussion points that we take down. Typically, when we're in a discussion with a charter school, it can range from 2 to 3 hours, right? I mean, especially typically longer if we're there with you in person, because we'll go on a site tour with you, see the school in person, visit all of the important things that you want to show us. But even just on a Zoom call, they can last, 2 to 3 hours. So it's a lot of information that we take in. The scorecard helps us boil down that information so that we're communicating to a rating committee, apples to apples information that we would, the same information that was presented for Charter Y in Florida is the same information presented for Charter D in Indiana. And it's important that we have that consistency, and a scorecard helps us achieve that. So again, it helps us apply the methodology in a consistent, transparent way. These are the broad categories for the charter school methodology. And so this is what we're looking at when we look at any charter school. And this is going to be the focus of our discussion when we get on the phone with you as an issuer. So scale and demand is 35% of the rating. That's the biggest category. And there we're talking about operating revenue. Typically, charters that have a little bit more wiggle room on their finances tend to be larger. And so that larger size is establishing typically a stronger competitive profile and also giving you a little bit more operating flexibility on your revenues expenditure side. So size we take into consideration. Competitive profile we take into consideration. I'm going to hold off on that one for just a sec. Then we have these liquidity metrics and leverage and coverage metrics. The methodology is quite balance sheet focused. Cash is very important. We want to make sure that the school has liquidity enough to manage through any sort of variability in enrollment, any variability in state aid financing. We want to know that you have the liquid resources to cushion against something unexpected. And so your balance sheet really comes into play. Balance sheet also comes into play when we talk about leverage, right? So how much debt are we taking on? How much debt can this school really support and maintain a comfortable operating flexibility for the school? We don't want to see a school take on too much debt. And we often do see schools that say, well, we're taking on this debt, we're going to build a high school and we're going to open up these seats and we're going to build it and the students will come. Yes, we see that model all the time. We see that model presented to us all the time. But we'd like to have an understanding of how we're going to support that debt in the event that we don't meet the enrollment targets that we're expecting. And that's when the phone call and the discussion really comes into play. So two things that are sort of the majority of our rating when put together: competitive profile here and charter renewal risk and government relations. 20% of the rating is focused on each of these. I point that out because these are really qualitative metrics. All the rest of the metrics that we're using in the scorecard and in the methodology are based on math, right? I could look at your audited financials for 20 and I could come up for 2020, excuse me, and I can calculate all of these ratios very quickly we can all agree on the math. It's public information. And that is a good part of the rating. A good part of the credit analysis is just, the information that's in your audit. The rest of it, though, is sort of less tangible. Competitive profile. How do your academic scores compare to your K-12 and your districts, and your other charter competitors in your, in your vicinity? What are your enrollment trends? What is your student retention rate? What is your teacher retention rate? All of those aspects of the school, the niche, the reason that sets us apart from others. I'm a parent, right? If I'm a parent looking at your school, why do I want to send my child to your school versus charter school X down the block, right? It all becomes a really important part of the discussion, and your messaging to us becomes very important. Also, another qualitative part of the ratings process or part of the ratings discussion is charter renewal risk and government relations. Embedded in that category is governance. And again, as BJ said, and I would stress, governance at your school is hugely important. How involved is the board? How involved does the board get in budget decisions, in maintaining your budget to actuals throughout the year? How involved is the board in sort of deciding on operations? What are your formal policies around day-to-day operations, around your finances? All of those governance aspects are hugely important, key to the rating, and should be as clearly defined as possible by you before you come through the ratings process. Just want to give, I know that we're almost at the end here, and again, questions, please just feel free to interrupt me and ask. Two really, I think common metrics that we look at when we think about charter schools, days cash on hand. I just wanted to show you the breakpoint for that metric in the scorecard. We're looking at about 100 days cash as the separation between non-investment grade and investment grade. It's kind of the threshold, the breakpoint. Same with coverage. We're looking at sort of a 120 coverage as the breakpoint between non-investment grade and investment grade. And this is kind of a summary of, I think, what I just covered. Typically a larger scale school, strong management and formal governance controls, can't stress that enough. Compelling reason for existence, a compelling market niche or academic profile, healthy authorizer relationship. In a weaker profile school, weak governance controls at the school or the operating level really is sort of a red flag for us. Crowded competitive landscape, the school is not distinguishable amongst peers, and any sort of threat to your charter from the authorizer, either due to poor financial performance or poor academic performance, really become key concerns for us in the ratings process. This is my information. I'm more than happy to answer any questions offline. More than happy, even if you're not coming through in a formal ratings process, but if you have questions, just general questions, more than happy to answer those questions via email or phone call. And I feel like I sort of rushed through, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time and mindful of you all having any questions or anything specific that you would prefer to speak about versus the slides that I had prepared. So wanted to give time for that.
I'll open it up for anybody that has any questions. I do have a couple that often come to us when we're going through this process for Nicole, but just want to open it up for anybody prior to that. All right. The question, two issues in Indianapolis. I know one of the big part of your rating is wait list to demonstrate demand. So oftentimes, in order for you guys to rate the school, you have to show that there is a demand for the school, and you rely on wait lists. Indianapolis obviously can't do that because they have a unified enrollment system. It's not unique to Indianapolis, but it's also out there. So my question is two parts. One is for schools in Indianapolis, how can they demonstrate demand? And a second part of that is for schools that are not in Indianapolis, what is considered a proper wait list rather than just, we had extra people come in and we told them no?
I don't know that we have anything that we consider to be a proper wait list. I mean, we're looking at state law in every state that we're operating in. So for any charter, we're being mindful of what your state law allows for or prevents. We want to have an understanding of the competitive profile. So that's the goal, right? The goal is to say we have 700 seats in our school. And for the next, we're issuing 25, 30, 40-year bonds, right? So we want to kind of say, no one can say what's going to happen 40 years from now. If we could, we wouldn't be sitting here on a Zoom call, we'd be playing lotto, right? But we want to have an understanding of, is the school going to be around for 10 years, right? For 15 years, how best can we tell that? And that's just, do parents want to send their kids here? And why would a parent want to send their child here? Number one is the why. And number two is sort of, how do we prove it? How do we reflect that in a condensed way? How do I explain it as your analyst to a group of rating committee participants? Waitlist is kind of a shorthand. But if the wait list isn't available, let's get creative about how do we prove it? How do we show it? Is there a way to say, look, this is how many applications came in versus seats available? Is there a way to say, this is our turnover rate? We only had, 20% of our seats available because all the rest were taken up by returned students. Typically, we're looking for strong demands in kindergarten and first grade because typically in a K-8 or even a K-12, right, we're looking at that kindergarten funnel. Kids come in K and sort of funnel through the rest of the years. So I don't know, Oscar, that there's sort of a rote, like I said, I think waitlist is sort of a shorthand, but in the absence of a waitlist, any ways that we can sort of quantify demand and make the assertion, hey, there's good demand here, parents want to send their kids to this school, however that comes about, we'll sort of take and run with. But that's really what we're looking for.
We have a question from Henry regarding 100 days unencumbered cash for the reserve. Henry, do you want to expand on your question a little bit? I think his question is, and I don't want to speak for Henry. And I'll try to, I don't want to speak for you, but I think what you were indicating on the 100 days was the breaking point with what you consider investment grade and not investment grade. But if you could go into the fact that is only one of multiple factors that go into the criteria. So not having 100 days doesn't necessarily you're not investment grade. Could you clarify that?
Right, exactly. So in the slide that I showed that had the breakdown of the percentages, the various ratios that we look at, those percentages, I know it kind of seems esoteric, like, how are you putting these things into percentages? But truly, the majority of our conversation during the rating committee process is focused around competitive profile, charter authorization risk, and governance. That's 40% of the rating. And that really is the majority of what we're talking about during the rating committee discussion. I'm not going to lie, cash is important. So getting to that 100 days cash mark, it does weigh on the rating for sure. And again, the rationale being, do we have a cushion to protect against variability in your enrollment or your any changes to state aid or your primary revenue source? It is important, but it's not the sole factor for sure.
Right, thank you, Nicole. We have 1 minute left, so we'll have to stop asking questions at this point. I want to thank everybody that participated for giving us your time. Again, this is being recorded and we will be distributing it to IDOE, who will distribute it to all of the authorized. But before signing off, I want to turn it back over to Brandon for any final words before ending the webinar.
I'd just like to thank you, Oscar, for hosting. A big thank you to the panelists for making time to join and sharing information in your areas of expertise. I hope this information was really helpful to attendees, and I thank you all for joining this webinar today.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you all. I'll be signing off now.
Bye.